The Stormspeeder Hammer Strike is a modification of the heavily armed and armored Stormspeeder. Specifically designed to hunt monsters and vehicles at close range, it is most used as a vanguard vehicle to weaken enemies for the rest of the Astartes army. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and welcome to another video where today we are covering the Stormspeeder Hammer Strike, a flying skimmer-type vehicle used by the Space Marines of course, Warhammer 40k. So the Stormspeeder Hammer Strike comes in at 125 points. It has the standard Stormspeeder stat line. It moves at a blazing fast, 14 inches. It's toughness 9 with a 3+ save, 11 wounds, leadership 6+, and OC 3, so fairly standard for the cost, though nothing special. In terms of ranged weapons, the Hammer Strike missile launcher is 36-inch range, with 2 attacks that hit on 3s at strength 9, AP 3, and damage D6, so a slightly upgunned missile launcher, which is solid enough against light vehicles. The Crack Storm Grenade Launcher is 1 attack. It has 2 of these that hit on 3s at 18-inch range with strength 9, AP 1, and damage D3, so a slightly downgraded Crack Grenade Launcher. And the Melta Destroyer is Melter 2, 18-inch range at 3 attacks that hit on 3s at strength 9, AP 4, and damage D6. Of course, Melta is quite good, though it can be quite difficult to wound tough things. Its melee is just Armored Hull, which is 4 attacks that hit on 4s at strength 4, AP 0, and damage 1. In terms of abilities, it has Deadly Demise D3, so a little bit of an explosion to be worried about if there's anything fragile nearby. And it has Deep Strike if you want to keep it in reserves to drop somewhere, though it is rather large, so doing that may be difficult just given its immense footprint. Its special rule is Hammer Strike. Each time this model has shot, select one enemy unit hit by one or more of the attacks. That unit cannot have the benefit of cover for the rest of the phase. This is a fairly interesting ability, though I would say is generally outclassed by its little brother, the Hail Strike, as +1 AP gives it effectively the same ability. However, this is still useful, especially for units that like to hide way back and use cover to keep themselves safe while plinking off shots with high power weaponry. Though again, I would still say it is a bit of a downgrade from the Hail Strike, though it is more general purpose, which does give it some bonus points as this can apply to anything instead of just non-monsters or vehicles. Next, we're going to move on to buffing options, and of course this is a vehicle, so the Tech Marine can give it +1 hit and some healing, though it isn't very practical, as he cannot keep up with it in any way, and also he would generally, this thing needs to get up close with its guns, so it can't even hang back and just fire off chip shots. And itself, of course, is a very solid buffer, because it gives, of course, that ignores cover. But it's nothing too special aside from that in terms of a direct buffer. Works well as an aggressive skimmer, though. And the things that it has, the meltaguns, the missile launchers, are quite capable against things like sentinels or mega knobs being perfect targets for it. And of course its rockets are the longest range, so just use those to apply the debuff to whatever unit is necessary if you want to debuff something aside from the main target. In terms of detachment options, Gladius, he does like Advance and Shoot because it lets him move even faster. Firestorm, he, of course, again, likes the Advance and Shoot, and Extra Strength can actually be very useful with the Meltagun and missiles to make them more effective against Toughness 10 vehicles. And Vulcan, if you're running him in this detachment, though I suppose you could run him elsewhere, Vulcan can give them rerolls to wound through his sort of Oath of Moment type ability. In terms of Stormlance, I'd say it's an okay target for Ride Hard and Ride Fast. And then Ravenwing, because it of course does have the keyword for Ravenwing, it does, of course, for the third time, like to advance and shoot. Rapid Reappraisal does allow it to redeploy for relatively cheap with Deep Strike, and of course that allows you to get within range of its best guns fairly easily, just by being able to jump across the board, though its high speed does mean it's slightly redundant to be using that. It is useful to cross distances so great that even this thing could not cover them. I did also want to give a small mention to the Iron Storm Assault Force, because that, of course, gives you the 1 reroll, which could be useful to reroll a wound on the Meltagun, especially when you're wounding on 5s, against things like Land Raiders or Imperial Knights, because wounding will be the tough part there, and also where Melta tends to fail. In terms of Crusade rules, it's, of course, very similar to the Stormspeeder Hail Strike. It likes Resilient Machine Spirit from the Space Marines for 2 extra wounds, though the other 2 are mainly pointless. In terms of weapon modification, extra strength or damage are appreciated by all of the main weapons. The Tyrannic War things can give it Blessed Hull, which is of course very nice. It gives it a 5+ invul. Auto Repair Nodes gives it healing every turn and reinforced superstructure. gives it -1 AP against strength 7 and below, so again, very useful against things like heavy bolters, custodies, and some kinds of plasma, especially if they're not overcharged for whatever reason. In terms of Pariah Nexus, Hardened Defenses is generally useful just to give it a little bit of extra durability, giving it a 6+ Feel No Pain, and Reaper does make it a very solid Hunter of Infantry, and Tank Hunter makes it a very, well, not very, but a reasonably effective Hunter of Vehicles, as that gives it, of course, reroll 1s to wound, which, while not the most impactful when it'll be wounding on 5s, is still very useful. Next, we do have to cover the competitors. And in terms of competitors, the first thing that comes to mind would, of course, be the Gladiator Lancer, which is a dedicated anti-armor destroyer, where this is, of course, what this also attempts to do, though the Lancer, of course, is maybe not significantly tougher, but it offers much more range and much more damage output, and it will be very hard to beat that in terms of this thing's damage. And the Predator Annihilator is also in the same price bracket and is also a dedicated tank hunter, and I think it actually does its job quite well compared to this, again, if you're just going for pure damage, but again, not a direct comparison. And the Stormspeeder Hailstrike, I think, offers, in my opinion, a better buff, of course, more restricted, but it is more restricted, but in a lot of ways more impactful, and even in matchups where you may be facing Imperial Knights or Chaos Knights, they often bring in allies of things like Inquisitorial Henchmen or Nurglings in the terms of Chaos, and getting extra AP against them, well, maybe not the Nurglings, but getting extra AP against things like Imperial Agents could be very useful just to scrape them off an objective more efficiently. Though, of course, this thing could do the job just well, it's just more tailored to taking out heavier infantry instead of hordes. And its buff, of course, can apply to anything, not just non-monsters or vehicles. And then, of course, Deimos Predator can take the Magna Melta Cannon, which completely outclasses this thing in every way, and bring 2 las cannons, all for 10 points cheaper. In terms of its best use, the Hammer Strike, in my opinion, is the weakest of the 3. It is rather unfocused, ignores cover, is solid, and it is the most general. It also isn't the most impactful. Again, the Hail Strike offering a directly better rule, generally. Though I also think its guns are a bit of a letdown. While Melta is quite good, it generally needs something extra to give it a little extra punch against the toughest vehicles in the game. But it will be very adept at killing things like Space Marines, Mega Knobs, Sentinels, other land speeders, and skimmer-type vehicles like that. But again, it's sort of punching down at this point's cost. It does still offer most of what the Hail Strike does, and if you do just want to get a fast-moving skimmer, and have the points, upgrading to a Hammer Strike I think is fine if you aren't trying to use it as a buffing piece, but instead an auxiliary, say, objective unit. But I would generally say the Hail Strike is the better of the 2 of these sort of cheaper ones, just because +1 AP is just going to be more impactful in more situations. And there's also, of course, just the fact that cover is generally so easy to get. While it's nice to deny, getting +1 AP does the same thing. Anyways, I've been Spoons Rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Storm Talon intercessors are generally scrambled out to take out enemy flying units, though they can also offer general air support with their VTOL capabilities, allowing them to fly around. They are a relatively recent Space Marine vehicle. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and today we are covering the Storm Talon Interceptor, one of the alternative build to the Storm Talon gunship, which is unsurprisingly very similar. So the Stormhawk Interceptor comes in at 155 points for a fairly standard plain stat line. He moves at 20+ inches, toughness 9 with a 3+ save and 10 wounds, leadership 6+, and OC nothing. In terms of ranged weapons, the Twin Assault Cannon is devastating wounds and twin, with 6 attacks that hit on 3s at 36-inch range at strength 6, AP 0, and damage 1. The Skyhammer missiles are anti-fly 2+, D3 attacks that hit on 3s at 48-inch range, with strength 8, AP 1, and damage D3. The Twin Heavy Bolter is sustained hits 1 and twin linked, with 3 attacks that hit on 3s, at 36-inch range with strength 5, AP 1, and damage 2. The Typhoon Missile Launcher has 2 profiles. Crack is 1 attack that hits on 3s at 48-inch range, with strength 9, AP 2, and damage D6. The Typhoon Missile Launcher Frag is Blast, 2d6 attacks that hit on 3s, at 48-inch range with strength 4, AP 0, and damage 1. The Las Talon is 2 attacks that hit on 3s at strength 10, AP 3, and damage D6 +1 at 36-inch range. The Icarus Storm Cannon is anti-fly 2+, with 6 attacks that hit on 3s at 48 inch range with strength 7, AP 1, and damage 2. In terms of melee weapons, it's a fairly weak armored hull with 3 attacks that hit on 4s at strength 6, AP 0, and damage 1, but obviously this thing isn't going to be in melee. In terms of ranged weapons, though, the assault cannon, Skyhammer missile, and Icarus pod are all solid, and the Las Talon and Typhoon missile launchers offer some decent anti-light vehicle firepower. In terms of abilities, it has Deadly Demise D3 and Hover, so you should always start it in hover mode. Interceptor, when this model makes a ranged attack that targets the unit that can fly, add 1 to the hit roll, which is fairly standard for this sort of plane, and at least does help it have somewhat of a niche against things like battlesuits or Space Marines with jump packs, if you give it the full anti-fly loadout. But I guess that depends on, of course, how you load it out. If you give it the missile launchers and the Las Talons, it will be better at hunting vehicles. If you give it the Skyhammer missiles and the Icarus Storm Cannon, it will be better at hunting infantry. However, though, we do need to cover its basic loadout first, which we are going to do now. It comes stock standard with a Twin Assault Cannon, a Skyhammer missiles, a Las Talon, and an armored hull. This is a fairly solid loadout, though I wouldn't say anything special, as it's a little all over the place. You can replace the Skyhammer missile launcher with either a Twin Heavy Bolter or a Typhoon missile launcher, and then the model's Las Talon can be replaced with one Icarus Storm Cannon. If you want to go for pure anti-infantry, I would generally keep the missiles and bring the Storm Cannon, just for a lot of anti-infantry shots. If you want to go for a little bit more tank hunting, bring the Typhoon missile launcher and the Las Talon, though I'd generally say that the anti-infantry build is probably a little better, just because of the volume of attacks you can get, even if they aren't necessarily the highest quality compared to things like a Las Talon. In terms of buff options, obviously the Space Marine Tech Marine would be very useful, with +1 to hit and healing. This is, of course, super useful for any vehicle, though it's not really consistent. You might be able to get it turn 1, but it does also have some overlap if you're shooting at flying things, as you'll already be at +1 to hit, which means this buff doesn't really do that much. It could hang back and fire air support, but I would say that's generally not super useful. The Stormspeeder Hail Strike can give it extra AP, which is always useful, and the Thunder Strike gives it +1 to wound. It can really help the missiles and the Las Talons actually do something against bigger vehicles like Land Raiders to get them more wounded effectively. In terms of detachments, Gladius gives it Advance and Shoot, which it does like. In terms of Ironstorm, the Las Talon does appreciate the rerolls because it's a decently large anti-tank shot. In terms of Firestorm, it likes Advance and Shoot, and extra strength can have its uses, especially on the Storm Cannon and the Missile Launcher, where you can get the Storm Cannon to wound on foot, or Space Marines on 2s innately, and the Missile Launcher can get to Strength 10 to help against things like Space Marine Gladiators or Predators. In terms of Stormlance, I'd say it's a fairly mediocre target for Ride Hard and Ride Fast, as that's a buff that would generally go a lot further on something that's a lot bulkier. And then in terms of the other detachments, as I mentioned, I won't be covering all the detachments, as there really isn't much reason to cover all of them, as I'd be saying the same thing over and over again, especially even more so with a plane like this. It does have the Raven Wing keyword, but it doesn't really benefit that much from that detachment, and it really just offers some anti-fly firepower or a few very mediocre anti-tank shots. Overall, I would say it's not really going to be a star in any of the detachments, even the ones I listed. I would still say it's more of a middling choice, and definitely not something you should try and build around, because plain Marines I don't think is a very strong build. In terms of Crusade rules, though, there are the Space Marines, which can give it Resilient Machine Spirit for just an extra couple wounds, which is always solid. Weapon modification, you could give it extra attacks or strength or AP, are all very useful on all the weapons. In terms of Tyrannic War, Blessed Hole is great for that 5+ invul. Auto Repair Node's very useful to make sure this thing stays in the fight a little bit longer. And Reinforced Superstructure is pretty helpful against things like Heavy Bolters, or Custodes shooting in melee if they get into melee with you. And Elite Crew does make it pretty much effectively 100% accurate against fly. In Pariah Nexus, though, Hardened Defenses is super useful, so it doesn't get blown off the board by one railgun attack. And Twin Linked on some of the weapons makes Tank Hunter a little redundant, though Reaper does make it a pretty competent infantry hunter, especially flying infantry. Though Tank Hunter definitely could be useful when you're shooting at something like, what are they called? Crisis Suits. Crisis Suits don't have the battle line keyword, or they don't have the vehicle keyword if I'm not mistaken, but that's not the point of this video. Regardless, I would say that both Hardened Defenses and Reaper are both solid upgrades, as this thing will mainly be hunting infantry with all of its guns. Moving on to competitors, unsurprisingly, it's pretty much the exact same as the Storm Talon gunship. The Gladiator, Lancer, and Reaper offer more focused versions of what this tank does, what this plane does. That's a lot tougher. The Predator Destructor also offers a jack of all trades if you wanted to give this thing a mixed loadout, and the Predator Destructor does a lot more than this thing does, as its autocannon and las cannons are just in general a lot more powerful than any of the weapons mounted here. And then if you're using Legends because you're playing Crusade or some other narrative game mode, the Deimos Predator is honestly really, really good. It's a 115-point Predator, basically, which can be geared out to do a lot more than this 155-point plane can. However, there isn't a lot of other competition for light flyers specifically, mainly because this thing is just better than the Storm Talon, and things like the Storm Raven or the Fire Eagle are a little too expensive for me to consider them direct competitors. However, they are certainly something to keep in mind if you want to go for planes and want something a little bit more powerful. I would generally say the Fire Eagle is the best flyer, though it's Legends, of course, and the Storm Raven offers the best plane that you can use in tournaments if that's what you care about. However, we have pretty much covered everything. We are going to, of course, do our little best use section, but I'm going to say it. There's really not that much to say about this plane, as it's fairly boring and also doesn't offer too much. I will say, though, I think the Stormhawk is probably one of the better sort of planes that aren't like a transport, i.e. like the Storm Raven. It's definitely better than the Storm Talon gunship. Personally, I would just gear it up with the anti-fly things and try and hunt things that are more valuable than it, whether it be crisis suits or like a Riptide, or you're just shooting at normal Space Marines, it'll still be pretty solid. But overall, it's just mediocre, is what I would call it. It is at least tougher than the Storm Talon, as it's toughness 9, not toughness 8. I'm not exactly sure why that is. And his damage is significantly better, as he gets 3 weapons instead of the 2 of the gunship, which seems a little strange. You think the interceptor would have less guns and the gunship would have more guns. However, in general, you are paying 155 points for what is effectively a very weak Predator Destructor that has less damage and is more fragile. And all of that for 25 points more. I would say even though it is an okay plane, planes on the whole are just generally going to be overshadowed for whatever role they are trying to fill out. And it's no different with the Stormhawk. Just because it stands out a little bit against the Storm Talon doesn't mean it's going to take home the gold. I've been Spoons Rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Storm Speeders are flexible and used in a variety of tactical roles by the Primaris Space Marines as anti-grav skimmer vehicles that can carry quite a lot of arms and armor. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and today we are covering the Storm Speeder Hail Strike, the light infantry slaying version of the Storm Speeders of the Primaris Space Marines. So the Storm Speeder Hail Strike comes in at a rather cheap 115 points for a relatively standard sort of skimmer profile, if not a little bulkier. It moves 14 inches, so it is very fast. Toughness 9, which is quite solid against most weapons, though again things like las cannons will give it trouble. A 3+ save is standard for Space Marines, and 11 wounds is actually quite a lot for this points cost. It's about as cheap as you can get those wounds. It has Leadership 6+, which is fine, but nothing special, and OC3 for taking objectives slightly more efficiently than something like a Rhino. In terms of ranged weapons, it has an Onslaught Gatling Cannon, which is devastating wounds with 8 attacks that hit on 3s at 24-inch range with Strength 5, AP 0, and Damage 1. A very solid flurry of anti-light infantry shots, and the Dev Wounds helps it chip in a little bit against bigger things. The Frag Storm Grenade Launchers, which gets 2 of, are Blast, D6 attacks that hit on 3s at 18-inch range, with Strength 4, AP 0, and Damage 1. Again, fairly standard light infantry killer with Blast, which is very useful. Twin Iron Hail Heavy Stubbers, which are Rapid Fire 3, twin-linked, with 3 attacks that hit on 3s at 36-inch range, with Strength 4, AP 0, and Damage 1. Again, similar to the Frag Storms, though the extra range does help. This will probably be your main way of applying the buff at long range. In terms of melee weapons, it just has its Armored Hull, which is 4 attacks that hit on 3s at Strength 4, AP 0, and Damage 1, which is really bad, but this thing wouldn't want to be in melee anyways. In terms of abilities, it has Deadly Demise, D3, and Deep Strike. Deep Strike is relatively handy, though it is rather big, so finding a small spot to drop it could be difficult. And Hail Strike is its core ability. After this model is shot, select one enemy unit to buy 1 or more of its attacks, excluding monsters or vehicles. Each time an Astartes unit attacks that enemy unit, add 1 to the AP of that attack. this is generally quite powerful. Some of the most tough things in the game can surprisingly be infantry, and so adding a way to reduce their survivability is very useful. And the Twin Hail Iron Hail Heavy Stubbers, being as long range as they are, mean it should be relatively easy to apply this to whatever target you want, presumably the Oath of Moment target. In terms of buff options for itself, which I wouldn't say is very important, the Tech Marine's +1 to hit is nice just to make it more consistent, though it has enough attacks, I would say that's not really a problem. And the healing can be nice, but again, I would say this isn't consistent because the Tech Marine is so slow, and this thing is going to want to be flying off to do other things while it shoots. And funnily enough, itself, I think, is a good buff option for everything else, because it is mainly a buffing piece, is what you're paying for all those points. So it works quite well with a lot of units, and is very useful for things like Predator Destructors to get them extra AP, or even things like Gatling cannons on a Predator Reaper. In terms of detachments, Gladius gives it advance and shoot, which it does like, so it can move even faster than it already does, averaging about 17 inches with advance and shoot. In terms of Firestorm, again, advance and shoot, very good. Extra strength is also pretty useful to make it more effective at killing things like orcs. And the Stormlance can give it ride hard and ride fast, which is alright, though I would say not exactly the most outstanding points for that. I would say something like a Storm Raven would be better. In terms of the Ravenwing detachment, again, it likes to advance and shoot, and Rapid Reappraisal is actually pretty interesting, as I believe it's the only target for that has Deep Strike, excluding the other Storm Speeders, to be picked up off the board and then dropped down wherever it needs, which, while not the most useful, can be helpful in something like the bottom of turn 4, where then, of course, at turn 5, you could get this thing literally anywhere on the board with Deep Strike. In terms of Anvil Siege Force, I think it's actually a very nice buffing piece there, because it makes things like bolters, heavy bolters, and other heavy weapons more effective against big infantry things. It's just another way to go all in on a single target, presumably again the Oath of Moment, and then for everything else it works fine as a objective grabber and buffer, as it's so fast it can do most things pretty easily. In terms of Crusade rules, Space Marines can give it an extra 2 wounds through Resilient Machine Spirit, which is actually pretty nice, which would make it significantly tougher. In terms of weapon modification, I would say extra damage is going to be your best bet, though strength isn't the worst, just to get them up to something a little more competent against Marines. And AP, of course, is always useful. If you're playing Tyrannic War, Blessed Hole is nice for that 5+ invul to make it really tough. Auto repair nodes also really useful to keep it from taking chip damage over the game, which means they'd really need to dedicate some firepower to it. Reinforced superstructure is helpful against things like, again, heavy bolters, custodes, and elite crew is generally nice for extra accuracy. And Pariah Nexus doesn't have the most, but hardened defenses is again very useful for a little feel no pain. And of course, Reaper does make it very good against infantry, which it will usually be shooting at anyways to apply its buff. Though, aside from that, there's not too much in Pariah Nexus that particularly directly benefits the Storm Speeders. However, I would say that the things it can get are relatively solid. Next, we're going to move on to the competitors for this thing's role. In terms of competitors, though, the Gladiator Reaper immediately comes to mind if you are just looking for anti-infantry firepower, but it's not a direct comparison, as the Gladiator Reaper is more something that would be a sort of central unit, or even something on the flanks. But this is more of a unit you would buy for its buff and more objective grabbing. The Predator Destructor pretty much falls into the same thing. It's a bit more jack of all trades, though. Though it is a little closer in the price bracket, as the Gladiator Reaper is a whole, 45 points more expensive than this, which is a significant investment. I also want to give a shout out to the Deimos Predator from Legends, which is an 115-point Predator that can take a lot of different weapons, and the main reason I call it out is because, again, it costs the exact same as the Storm Speeder, which means if you're just looking for a damaging vehicle that's decently fast, the Deimos Predator offers what I would consider a significantly better product. But of course, that's only if you're using Legends, presumably in something like a narrative campaign, which is something that I personally quite enjoy. I will be doing a video on the Deimos Predator, mainly because it's really interesting and I think offers some great fire support for Crusade Space Marine forces. However, that's not the point of this video. We are, of course, focusing on the Storm Speeder. I just wanted to make it more known how good the Deimos Predator, I think, actually is. Next, though, we have to move on to its best use. And the Hailstrike is really a not very complex unit. It has a decent spread of anti-infantry weapons. Of course, that's its main role, is just blowing up light infantry like Guardsmen, Eldar, Gretchen, things like that. I will say its toughness is quite solid for the cost. It is, of course, very vulnerable to things like melta-guns, but anything less than that it will be quite tough towards, and will take a decent amount of firepower to kill. It does stand out in its features with its blazing speed. In a lot of ways, it's not too dissimilar to a Distraction Carnifex with how big it is, though it's more so not as intimidating to look at, so you'll probably at least get 2 turns out of this thing giving its buffs, and also flying around the board to get to other objectives. In terms of its buff, though, things like Custodes or Meganobs will really not appreciate the extra AP, making everything from stuff like Predator Destructors or Gladiator Reapers significantly more effective. The Predator Destructor, specifically, getting all the way up to AP 3 against infantry, which certainly reminds me of 9th edition. And even outside of that, it works well enough as a fast-moving vehicle just to do objectives if you're fighting something like Knights, where it likely won't be as effective, but even then, if they have Imperial agents, it would be useful to shoot at them. Overall, it's a fine vehicle, but it's very humble, but it just does its job well, and that's fine enough. I've been Spoons Rattling, hope you enjoyed this video. The Storm Raven is a rather recent addition to the Space Marines armory. It's STC discovered in the 41st millennium, reportedly by the Blood Angels, or rather a tech priest in their service. It is a transport armed to the teeth with guns, proper in the Space Marine fashion. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and today we are covering the Storm Raven of the Space Marines. So, the Storm Raven comes in at a princely 280 points. It has a fairly standard plain stat line, though it is a little tougher than usual. It moves 20 plus inches, thanks to the fly rules. Its toughness 10, 3 plus save, a 6 plus invulnerable, 14 wounds at leadership 6 plus, and OC nothing rather. In terms of ranged weapons, it has a twin assault cannon, which is dev wounds and twin linked at 6 attacks, hit on 3s at 36-inch range with strength 6, AP 0, and damage 1, a fine flurry of anti-horde. Sky Strike missiles, which are 1 attack that hit on 3s at 48-inch range with strength 9, AP 2, and damage d6. This twin heavy bolter is sustained hits 1 and twin linked. It has 3 attacks at 36-inch range that hit on 3s at strength 5, AP 1, and damage 2. The Hurricane Bolters are twin-linked rapid-fire 6 with 6 attacks that hit on 3s at 24-inch range with strength 4, AP 0, and damage 1. Then, moving on from there, we have the Typhoon Missile Launcher, which has Crack and Frag. In terms of Crack, it has 2 attacks that hit on 3s at strength 9, AP 2, and damage d6, fairly standard for a missile launcher. If you go on to Frag, it has 2d6 attacks that hit on 3s at 48-inch range with strength 4, AP 0, and damage 1. The Twin Multi-Melta is Melta 2 and, of course, 18-inch range with Twin Linked with 2 attacks that hit on 3s at strength 9, AP 4, and damage d6. This is very good anti-tank, of course. And then the Twin Las Cannon is Twin with 1 attack that hits on 3s at 48-inch range with strength 12, AP 3, and damage d6 plus 1. Again, a solid anti-tank shot. And then the Plasma Cannon has two profiles, standard and overcharge. At standard, it's Blast with Hazardous at 36-inch range with D3 attacks that hit on 3s, strength 7, AP 2, and damage 2. And then if you overcharge it, it goes to strength 8, AP 3, and damage 3. A great weapon the whole way around. In terms of melee weapons, the has just an Armored Hull, which is 6 attacks that hit on 4s at strength 8, AP 0, and damage 1, which is nothing special for a vehicle at this price point, but it is a ranged vehicle, of course. It has Deadly Demise D6 and Hover. I would always start it in Hover. Its main ability is Armored Resilience. Each time an attack is allocated to this model, subtract 1 from the damage characteristic of that attack. Very useful against things like plasma guns or autocannons. The transport is capacity of 12 Astartes infantry and 1 Dreadnought. Jump packs, Wolfen, Gravis, and Terminators take up 2 slots, and Centurions take up 3. So, of course, you can bring quite a lot of stuff in here, and, of course, the Dreadnought on the back is super useful, because, of course, dropping in something as big as a Dreadnought is A, very cool, and B, very powerful. I'll cover over the best loadout, in my opinion, in the loadout section, but it does also have a standard damage ability at 1 to 5 wounds remaining. You subtract 1 from its hit rolls when it's making attacks. Now, we are going to move on to the loadout. And its base loadout is 2 Storm Strike missile launchers, a Twin Assault Cannon, the Typhoon Missile Launcher, and the Armored Hull. However, the Twin Assault Cannon can be replaced with one of the following, either the Twin Heavy Plasma Cannon and the Twin Las Cannon. And the Typhoon Missile Launcher, which is usually nose-mounted, can be replaced with one of the following, 1 Twin Heavy Bolter or 1 Twin Multi-Melta, and this model can be equipped with 2 Hurricane Bolters. Of course, start with the Hurricane Bolters. They're super useful just to clear out hordes, and they also look really cool, so that's a benefit.
The Typhoon missile launcher, I'd say I would generally replace with the multi-melta, though I don't think the missile launcher is the worst if you want the flexibility. And then me personally, I like the heavy plasma cannon, mainly because of its blast and two profiles that are very solid, though of course the las cannon is very good, and the assault cannon offers a lot of anti-infantry firepower, and since it's twin-linked, you will be very consistently getting at least a couple devastating wounds. But of course, my personal choice would be the plasma cannon, the multi-melta, and the hurricane bolters. All very solid to help it deal with all kinds of infantry and to chip wounds off of bigger things thanks to all the twin-linked attacks, which are very useful and pair very well with the Oath of Moment target. This thing really can light up a lot of enemies with how many guns it has mounted all over its hull. Though, of course, you do also need to make good use of its transport capacity, which isn't super hard to do. Next, we're going to move on to the buff options. So the Tech Marine is the obvious one. He gives him +1 to hit and he heals. Of course, you won't really be able to keep up with this thing, but it is generally very powerful if you can hit it with Oath of Moment, say on turn 1, as the Tech Marine happens in the command phase. So you can hit this thing with the +1 to hit and the heal, and then have it go off and start moving into the mid-board. Though if you were running it as sort of a gun turret, I suppose you would also be a solid buff there, though I generally wouldn't run it as that. The Redemptor is a great mixed threat dreadnought to drop off with this thing, and the Brutalis is also very good to have all that melee damage be dropped right in the mid-board. The Dreadnought, sort of Venerable Dreadnought, is not great in general, though I would say this is one of the better ways to run it, just dropping it out of one of these things. Terminators and Assault Terminators, of course, love the extra speed, but they both offer their own advantages to jumping out. Terminators having their range and Assault Terminators having the more melee damage. Of course, they will just mainly appreciate being able to move up 20 inches turn 1 and then get out turn 2. Sword Brethren are a solid, big melee unit to run. To jump out, all melee units appreciate that. Inner Circle Companions, Blade Guard, Deathwing Knights are my favorite unit to run in it, just because it's pretty much the most dangerous unit you can fit in here. It perfectly fits 5 of them and a captain, and that is a lot of dangerous melee and high durability models to just be dropping out in the mid-board after moving 20 inches on turn 1, which of course has a lot of synergies with things like Gladius Strike Force, and for example, Firestorm could also, if you wanted to run a ranged unit in here, I think that would also work just fine. But generally, I'll just put a Redemptor and a Deathwing unit of Deathwing Knights or Terminators with a captain attached in there, and just send it up the mid-board to drop off and do a lot of destruction, as the Space Marines love to do. Next, we are going to move on to detachments, and I've decided to stop covering every detachment as I find myself repeating a lot often. I'm only covering the detachments where I think this thing actually gains anything. In every other detachment, it can do its job just fine of transporting things. I don't need to say that 15 times. Gladius, this does like advance and shoot, just to get up the board even faster, and of course the things getting out love the advance and charge on turn 2. In terms of Iron Storm, it's a huge vehicle with lots of guns, so it does appreciate the buffs here. The las cannon especially loves the reroll 1 attack. Firestorm, it does like the advance and shoot, and getting strength 5 on your hurricane bolters is really solid, just because, again, lots of shots with twin linked is very good. It could use Unforgiven Fury in the Unforgiven Task Force if you wanted to run that, though I wouldn't say the detachment's really worth running. And the Liberator Assault Group / Lost Brethren I wanted to give a special mention to, because by itself it doesn't really benefit, but you could transport something like Foot Death Company up the board with a Death Company Dreadnought, and that would be a lot of melee might, and if you were running both of those already, this would kill 2 birds with 1 stone, obviously, to transport both of them. And also, personally, I just think it's kind of a cool visual to have all these raving mad Space Marines jumping out of a plane. From there, we're going to move on to the competitors, of course, and there certainly are quite a bit of competitors. The Space Marines tend to have that sort of thing where every slot can be filled in different ways. Got mixed up. Crusade rules are next. Resilient Machine Spirit from the Space Marines is solid for a bit more toughness. In terms of weapon modification, extra attacks and strength are appreciated by all the main weapons, I'd say, except the Hurricane Bolters. They'd appreciate extra damage. In terms of Tyrannic War, Blessed Hull is great for the extra toughness. Auto Repair Nodes, super useful. That, of course, gives you healing and a 5+ invuln. Reinforced Superstructure makes it more resilient to things like plasma guns that aren't overcharging. And Elite Crew could be solid, though it does overlap with Oath of Moment. And then in Pariah Nexus, Hardened Defenses is nice on a big vehicle like this. It's that 6+ Feel No Pain. The Twin Linked makes things like Tank Hunter a little bit redundant. But Reaper and Heavily Armored are both very solid for this guy, as obviously that gives you more defense by able to turn a failed save to 0, and Horde Clearing respectively, as you get to reroll ones to hit with Reaper, which pairs very well with your Hurricane Bolters. If you want to send your bigger guns towards something like a tank, you could send your Hurricane Bolters into something like Cultists and really tear them up. Of course, though, there is still some slight overlap with Oath of Moment, but I don't think it's necessarily the end of the world. Now, we are going to move on to competitors. So, the first competitor that obviously comes to mind is the Land Raider, which the Storm Raven is effectively a flying Land Raider, but I'd say the Land Raider generally does the transport job better, as even though this thing moves 20 inches, it can't move on the second turn and then drop its units to charge, so the Land Raider catches up to it on turn 2 anyways. As I mentioned here, the Assault Ramp does make up the speed difference, though I will say the Dreadnought jumping out of this thing is very cool and does offer something extra that the normal Land Raider can't do, and the Repulsor is pretty much the same thing. And then I also want to cover, of course, some legends. The Storm Eagle gunship is a Heresy-era plane that basically does everything this does, but better. It is tougher for cheaper, has more transport space, up to 22 slots. It has, of course, it doesn't have the bubble gunner, but the Vengeance launchers are arguably better than the Hurricane bolters, and it still packs the nose weapon. And the 2 missiles are better, all for 25 points less. And I wanted to mention the Spartan as well, which is similar to the Storm Raven, though it's 40 points more expensive, but also significantly more tough, and its laser destroyers are even more destructive. So the Storm Eagle, I would say, is just head and shoulders better than this thing. If you're running a Crusade, maybe consider that. They are on the same base, so you could proxy one for the other. In terms of the best use, though, which is what we have to cover last, the Storm Raven, to me, is a very special plane. It's my favorite of the planes in 40k, and I just think the vibe is very cool. When I think of it's very similar to, like, the clone gunship from Star Wars. The imagery it brings up is just too cool. You have this thing flying up the board, and then 5 or 6 Terminators jump out of it. You know, they do their big landing, and then a Dreadnought drops in behind them. That's, like, the sickest thing imaginable. So while it's certainly finishing in, like, second place in competitive, or whatever you want to call it, I honestly don't care, because this thing is cool enough that it doesn't, like, its competitive performance is null, because, truth be told, 40k is cool. It's about being cool, and this thing is really cool. However, covering how you can make it stronger, a Tech Marine is really useful for all those guns, whether you're running like a Tech Marine on bike from Legends, or it's just turn 1 when they're deployed together. There is a lot of guns. They appreciate the +1 to hit. It really is a jack of all trades, but master of none, and an absolute favorite unit of mine. It is a rare day where my Marines go to war without their clone gunship behind them to drop in some of the most elite Marines in my chapter. Anyways, I've been Spoons Rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time. The Stormspeeder Thunderstrike is the final variation of the Stormspeeder model, equipped with the heaviest weapons available to help it hunt tanks and enemy monsters. It is of course fast and heavily armored, as all the Stormspeeders are. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and today we are covering the final of the Stormspeeders. The Stormspeeder Thunderstrike, equipped with some of the best weapons available to this chassis, as well as one of the best rules for these chassis. The Stormspeeder Thunderstrike is the priciest, though, at 150 points, for a fairly standard, if nothing special, stat line of the Stormspeeders at movement 14 inches, toughness 9, a 3+ save, 11 wounds, leadership 6+, and OC 3. For this points cost, it is not tough in the slightest, like its little brothers, though granted for its special rule, I think that's fair. In terms of ranged weapons, the Storm Fury missile is one attack that hits on 3s at 48-inch range with strength 12, AP 3, and damage d6+1, so effectively a las cannon. And the Thunderstrike Las Talon is 2 attacks that hit on 3s at 36-inch range with strength 9, AP 3, and damage d6+1, so a less powerful las cannon. The Twin Icarus rocket pod is anti-fly 2+, and twin linked at ballistic skill 3+, with d3 attacks that hit on 3s at 24-inch range with strength 4, AP 1, and damage 2. Good for dealing with Space Marines. The melee weapon is simply Armored Hull, which is 4 attacks that hit on 4s at strength 4, AP 0, damage 1. That's a lot of 4s, and it is also very bad in melee. Not only for the cost, but just in general. This thing doesn't want to be in melee at all, if you couldn't tell. In terms of core abilities, it has Deadly Demise D3, so a small explosion to worry about. And it has Deep Strike if you wish for it to come in on the enemy flanks, though given its immense footprint, this may be slightly difficult to do.
Thunderstrike is its special rule. After this model has made its attacks, select one enemy monster or vehicle hit by those attacks. Each time a friendly Astartes model makes a ranged attack against that unit, add 1 to the wound roll. This is, of course, catastrophically powerful for a lot of weapons against the biggest enemy target that will very quickly fold under these circumstances. Though, of course, you pay no small price for it at this 150-point, very fragile model. Though, even just getting 1 turn out of this could allow for a huge positive points trade of ensuring that this thing hits something that then goes on to be blown up by something significantly cheaper, whether that target be something like an Imperial Knight or a Imperial Guard, Bane Blade, or Rugal Dorn. Moving on to buff options, Tech Marines can of course give +1 to hit, and healing is very good, but of course I would not say it's super consistent unless you're just keeping it hanging back, firing off its buffs. But that isn't what I would generally use, though I don't think it is awful, and I think that denying its great range and speed is doing it a great disservice. And then of course itself is a buffing option for dealing with, again, the toughest stuff in the game, so giant knights, etc. It excels with anything that has twin linked, and las cannons also really appreciate it. It can make even things like humble bolters threat to medium monsters, and plasma will be a full force anti-tank weapon. Of course, this thing's very pricey, but I'd say this buff is something that your enemy would seriously have to worry about. In terms of detachment options, there's of course Gladius, which is of course very good for the advance and shoot. Firestorm can give it extra strength, which is nice on the las talon. And once again, advance and shoot, very nice on something this fast. Stormlance, this gives it an okay target for ride hard and ride fast, though of course doesn't want to be in melee, so it would need some form of advance and shoot. Ravenwing, again, it likes advance and shoot, and rapid reappraisal does offer the ability for it to redeploy, though at this point's cost I wouldn't say it's quite as standout as it is on something like the Storm Speeder Hail Strike. Iron Storm, the big las cannon, of course, or the big missile, really likes the reroll, and giving tanks like Reaper +1 to wound can be extremely nasty, so I would say it's right at home in Iron Storm. And then, of course, for the rest of the detachments, it offers general useful objective grabbing abilities, and its buff can be very useful for just about any formation, supposing it at least has a decent contingent of fire support, which most Space Marine forces tend to bring along with them given their whole balanced approach to making war. Though if you are running a mainly melee thing, whether that be in like Liberator Assault Group, it definitely loses some of its luster. In terms of Crusade rules to cover, in terms of Space Marines, of course, Resilient Machine Spirit is really the only useful thing for it, as it gives it +2 wounds and the rest are both melee buffs. In terms of weapon modifications, buffing up the las talon is a very good idea with either extra damage and then buffing up its Sky Strike missiles with a +1 attack would also be super useful and would make this thing significantly more damaging. In terms of Tyrannic War, Blessed Hole gives it a great extra toughness with a 5+ invuln. Auto Repair Nodes, of course, heals it every turn, and Reinforced Superstructure is super useful against things like Standard Plasma, Custodes Melee, and Heavy Bolters. Elite Crew also gives it nice extra accuracy, and in Pariah Nexus, Hardened Defenses is very useful for a vehicle like this, as it gives it that Feel No Pain, and Tank Hunter is generally useful and will help it excel against its intended targets, while also making it very effective against things like light vehicles that it will maul quite effectively with those reroll 1s, when it will be wounding most of them on 3s. Of course, we do all have to move on to the competition, because for at this point's cost you can get quite a lot, and one of those things you can get is the Gladiator Lancer. If you just need direct anti-tank, it's hard to beat the Lancer, because it offers a even bigger laser destroyer that has longer range and even more damage. And then, of course, I did also want to shout out the Predator Annihilator, because it is similar to the Lancer, though more of a discount version. Its damage isn't quite as apocalyptic, though it is cheaper this unit and offers better anti-tank damage on its own. And then if you are running something like a Crusade or a narrative campaign or game, the Legends Deimos Predator offers excellent anti-tank firepower at close range on a much cheaper chassis, clocking in at only 115 points. Of course, though, this isn't exactly the same role, it's more so just an alternative version of it, as it can't get something like a top-mounted las cannon to really go all in on long-range anti-tank firepower. Its best anti-tank weapon, of course, being the Melted Destroyer, which is very close range. That of course, is for the Deimos Predator video when we get to that. In terms of any other competitors, honestly, I think the Storm Speeder Hail Strike gives it a solid run for its money with another good buff if you're more worried about infantry. But these are definitely the two main ones in the same price bracket. I would mention things like Land Raiders or Repulsors, but they cost so much more in points that I don't think it's really even fair to compare the two in the same bracket. Moving on to the best use for this thing, I believe it is the best of the three. I think that its buff is just powerful enough that it has a place in most armies, because a lot of enemies you'll be facing will have some form of vehicle, whether that be a big transport or just a big shooty vehicle that really needs to go down quickly. And this thing gives it a very, very competent way of doing that through its humongous buff for whatever your army's shooting at. And some armies, like Knights, for example, will be weeping should they see this on the other side of the table, because it means that Oath of Moment, which is already extremely effective against them, will have a partner in crime with the +1 to wound, which can mean that they have to delegate a lot of firepower to destroy this thing, whether they want to risk getting something like a +1 to wound on one of their most important Knights, which would then, of course, get blown up by just about everything that focuses fire at it, thanks to the +1 to wound, which makes everything significantly more effective against them, especially the likes of las cannons and plasma guns. Anyways, that brings us to the end of our three-part review on the Storm Speeders. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly didn't, really. These units are all so extremely similar that it became slightly mind-numbing to talk about. Hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. The Storm Talon is a gunship available to the Space Marines that was discovered more recently than most of their vehicles and weaponry. In the universe, it is a flexible and powerful piece of war machinery used by the Space Marines to offer close air support and strafing attacks. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and today we are covering the Space Marine aircraft called the Storm Talon gunship, one of the sort of middling era flyers of the Space Marines. The Storm Talon comes in at 165 points. It is a pretty standard plain stat line at 20 inches of movement, only toughness 8, a 3+ save, and 10 wounds with leadership 6+, and OC nothing as it's an aircraft. In terms of ranged weapons, it has a twin assault cannon, which is devastating wounds and twin linked, handy enough to stack dev wounds on things and to clear hordes. Sky Strike missiles, which is one attack that hits on 3s at 48-inch range with strength 8, AP1, and damage 3. D3 rather. And the Twin Heavy Bolter is sustained hits 1, and twin linked with 3 attacks that hit on 3s at 36-inch range, with strength 5, AP1, and damage 2. The Typhoon Missile Launcher, of course, has 2 different profiles. The Crack is 1 attack that hits on 3s, 2 attacks that hit on 3s at 48-inch range with strength 9, AP2, and damage D6, so a fine little anti-light vehicle attack. And then you have the Frag mode, which is 2d6 attacks that hit on 3s at 48-inch range with strength 4, AP0, and damage 1, and blast, which is useful enough for shooting out hordes, though not much above like Imperial Guards or Sisters will really feel anything major when getting hit by this. And then the Twin Las Cannon is twin linked with 1 attack that hits on 3s at 48-inch range with strength 12, AP3, and damage D6+1. A fine enough anti-tank shot, though of course it's only 1, so it will be very swingy as to whether it actually does anything. Though that's true of a lot of weapons, I suppose. In terms of melee weapons, it just has an armored hull, which is 3 attacks that hit on 4s at strength 6, AP0, damage 1, obviously very bad in melee. And a quick side note, the Sky Strike missiles have 3 attacks, not just 1. In terms of abilities, it is Deadly Demise D3, so a small explosion, though definitely something to keep in mind, though given its speed it will likely be operating on its own, and it does have hover, and I would generally keep this thing in hover mode, just so you don't have to deal with the whole aircraft straight line rules. And then its ability is Strafing Run. Each time this model makes an ranged attack against a target that can't fly, add 1 to the hit roll, so this will be most things in the game, but it is a solid enough roll just to get it hitting on 2s, though this sort of overlaps a little bit with Oath of Moment, as with Oath of Moment it would already be super accurate, so this is kind of redundant. The model is equipped with the Skyhammer missile launchers and the Twin Assault Cannon and the armored hull. In terms of what you can do, you can swap out the Skyhammer missile launcher with either 1 Twin Heavy Bolter, 1 Twin Las Cannon, or 1 Typhoon missile launcher. I would say that all of these options are fairly mediocre. The Las Cannon is a solid profile, though only one of them is kind of disappointing at this price tag. The Heavy Bolter is a Heavy Bolter, so fairly middling, and the Typhoon Missile Launcher is flexible, though again, nothing standout. I would probably just keep it stock standard, just as it is as it comes. In terms of buff options, of course, a Tech Marine would be very useful with that +1 to hit.
though of course it is a plane, so he won't really be able to keep up with it very effectively. So really, it's just sort of a turn 1 kind of thing. The Storm Speeder Hail Strike can give him extra AP, which is generally useful. And the Storm Speeder Thunder Strike can give it +1 to wound, which is actually pretty nice with all of the twin-linked weapons it has. If you take the las cannon, this would generally be pretty useful just to have that, usually wounding on 3s or 2s and then re-rolling. Very useful. But aside from that, there isn't much else that can specifically buff this guy, at least not that I can think of off the top of my head. In terms of detachments, though, Gladius, he likes Advance and Shoot, which is, of course, true of most things. Iron Storm, the Twin Las Cannon, does appreciate the reroll 1 attack per turn. Firestorm, again, he likes Advance and Shoot, so the Assault is pretty nice, though the extra Strength isn't the most impactful on most of his weapons. Stormlance, he is a mediocre target for Ride Hard and Ride Fast, just given that really won't make him that tough anyways. And then the rest, he generally doesn't get any buffs, as planes are very niche to get buffs in general. And this offers, in general, nothing too much aside from just a flurry of anti-infantry shots, which is the main problem with the Storm Talon, is despite being called a gunship, it has a very, very weak smattering of guns. In fact, it only has 2 guns in any of its configuration, which is rather disappointing for something called a gunship, which you would usually expect to have a full suite of weaponry, not just sort of some anti-infantry guns or a very mediocre anti-tank gun. However, I suppose that its job can be done in any detachment. It's just the ones that I listed here are really the only ones that actually give it anything. It does have the Ravenwing keyword, but most of that keys off of the mounted keyword, so not quite super useful, even though it does have the keyword for the Ravenwing detachment. In terms of Crusade rules, Resilient Machine Spirit is handy enough for 2 extra wounds from the Space Marines. In terms of weapon modification, extra attacks and strength or AP are all super useful. Extra attacks and strength can be very good for the las cannon if you're running that, and AP on the assault cannon will not go awry. In terms of Tyrannic War, Blessed Hull is super useful for the extra toughness. Auto repair nodes generally useful just to keep things in the fight longer, and reinforced superstructure is pretty useful against like heavy bolters or Custodes melee. Elite Crew does make it effectively 100% accurate against things with non-flies. It'll be hitting on 2s and rerolling 1s. In terms of Pariah Nexus, Hardened Defenses is generally very useful for vehicles, just to give it the extra chance to stay around, and this thing's pretty fragile, so the opportunity to get another round of shooting is not going to hurt. Though all the Twin Link does make something like Tank Hunter pretty redundant. Reaper does make it, I would say, quite a competent infantry hunter, if nothing else really. That would have hitting most infantry on 2s and rerolling 1s, so again it would be effectively 100% accurate against them. And of course the assault cannon is quite good at killing infantry, so it can do that job fairly well, though I would still say quite mediocre, especially considering the sort of legends stuff you can bring when playing Crusade. In terms of competitors, the Gladiator, Lancer, and Reaper are effectively just like this thing, but actually really crazy. The Lancer for anti-tank duties and the Reaper for anti-infantry. So if you just want a vehicle to do one of those jobs, the Gladiator tanks do it just fine. And if you want a jack of all trades, the Predator Destructor does that job plenty good. He has, of course, his big autocannon, which is better than any weapon on this thing. And then he gets 2 las cannons on the flanks, so generally pretty useful. The Stormhawk Interceptor is, in my opinion, just a much better version of this. It's cheaper, and you get a few more guns. While its special rule isn't quite as strong, I would say that doesn't really matter, as it's just going to be doing more damage in general. In terms of legends, most of the legends flyers are all pretty large, so they're not really in the same category. However, I did want to mention the Deimos Predator F, because it is a cheap predator, cheaper than any of the other predators, and it can carry a lot of very interesting guns to become, again, a sort of jack of all trades, or very specialist focused, that can be geared for pretty much anything this can do, but better. So again, it's really hard to find a place where the Storm Talon is particularly good, and that's definitely, not a shame. It's a shame, because it's nice to see, a lot of internal usages, even if they're very niche, and especially in things like competitive, casual games. The Storm Talon really just doesn't feel like a gunship at all. It feels more like a scout plane or something like that. Its special rule, I think, is actually pretty solid, but generally it lacks a sort of signature armament. Twin assault cannons are very nice as sort of an auxiliary weapon to clear out hordes or just stack some extra dev wounds, but as its main armament, I would say is very disappointing. If I were to run one, I would maybe just bring the heavy bolters and a assault cannon, or maybe the missile launcher, just to give it a lot of medium strength attacks to punch down at light infantry. But I understand why you would maybe want to take the las cannons. But I just don't find it compelling for the points, and even in Crusade stuff, I don't think it really gets anything particularly useful. And in terms of its model, honestly, which is, honestly a big part of running a unit, I don't particularly like this plane. It's very chunky and weird, and I know it's technically like a VTOL tilt rotor kind of deal, but I just think it looks rather bulbous and strange. If you want a real gunship, just bring its bigger brother, the Storm Raven, which is a much cooler model and much better unit. I've been Spoons Rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.